Yay! So welcome, hopefully, is this on? We're good. Welcome to all of those who've come to talk about millennials and the vote. I think today is going to be a wonderful program. Thank you for coming to George Washington University. I'm Laura Brown. I'm the interim director of the Graduate School of Political Management. And for those of you who don't know, we are the first and foremost school of applied politics, advocacy, and communications. And we are really the only school in the country that specializes in what I call MBAs for politics. So I wanted to thank our alumnus, who happens to actually work at Common Cause, who brought us this opportunity, Jay Riestenberg. And we're really happy to have Common Cause here for this tremendous panel and this wonderful report that they are releasing. As many of you may know, millennials are now the largest generation of living Americans. Unfortunately, they failed to wield a proportionate amount of political clout due to their lower rates of voting. And we know that while everyone at GW kind of comes to GW to be active and engaged citizens in politics and the world, it's really important that those friends and families of yours all across the country and the world really do think about politics and that you help to engage them personally in this. So we do hope that this discussion today will provide you with some additional tools to help your friends, help your family in the United States cast their ballots, register, participate, and be involved. Today, I'd like to sort of give a warm welcome to all of our guests, U.S. Representative Don Beyer and Allegra Chapman of Common Cause, who's here. We have Cliff Kang of Polynav, Michelle Jawando of the Center for American Progress, Brianna Ross of the U.S. Student Association, Yael Bromberg of Georgetown University Law Center, and our moderator, Ari Berman of The Nation. We're really looking forward to hearing their insights and to your participation a little later as well. So thank you again for coming today, and let me introduce Allegra Chapman, Director of Voting and Elections at Common Cause. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So it's less than 2 months away from the election, 49 days if you're one of those people who eats, breathes, and lives the stuff, which I think a lot of us here are. And already it's been one of the most spectacular races that I think any of us has seen, spectacular by all accounts. We could probably have a panel to talk just about the candidates themselves, but we're here instead to talk about the people who will elect the next commander-in-chief, the voters, you. Particularly, we're going to talk about the millennial vote. So, as Dr. Brown was already mentioning, millennials now are one of the largest populations, representing about a third of the country. You guys are on par now with the baby boomers. And, at the same time, too, millennials do not adequately represent themselves in the electorate. True, millennials came out, younger voters came out. They elected Bill Clinton, and then again came out in higher numbers than usual to elect President Obama in a very historic election. At the same time, that kind of voting turnout has not been sustained. And why? Millennials definitely have shown that they have the civic muscle to get things done, whether it's been through Occupy or Black Lives Matter or any number of environmental issues. Younger Americans are coming together to make change and to get things done. And so the question becomes, how do we translate this civic muscle into the kind of political muscle that shows up and has a regular presence at the ballot box? So to be sure, a number of laws have hindered students and younger people from really voting and voting regularly. In the past few years, particularly after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, We've seen handfuls of states, nearly half the country, put onerous measures into place that particularly are aimed at or affect people of color, but at the same time, too, really marginalize students and youth. We've seen this through a number of student ID bills go into effect across the country. At the same time, we've seen this fight back against that. And whether it was advocacy groups, including many student organizations, they have said enough is enough. Thanks to that good work, the courts across the country have called out a lot of these tactics for what they are, vote suppression. At the same time, we can't let this just be a defensive fight. It can't be. And what we're seeing is that in addition to using litigation to fight back, we're seeing a lot of states and advocates across the country put good policies and reforms on the books, like voter pre-registration for one. And really collectively, we're seeing students in their campuses, in their communities, also engage youth on issues that they care about and hone the issues that they think are most important, also using tactics that I think a lot of younger people would use, sort of like a flash mob at the polling place. So, I think there can be a feeling sometimes that one's voice doesn't matter, that it doesn't count, that there's just a feeling of disempowerment. And I don't think that's just something that's unique to the millennial generation. Of course, during the Q&A afterward, that we're gonna wanna hear from you on that. That is not a sentiment that's unique to the millennial generation, though. As a Gen Xer, and I can see there's some baby boomers in the crowd too, that's a sentiment that can be alive and well. After all, there is a lot that still needs to happen in order for our democracy to really reflect us all, in order for it to be a democracy that works for everyone. But when Americans come together in numbers, we have seen them make great change. We have seen them put into effect some excellent policies, and we've seen them elect people who need to be at the helm. Remember, it's who your sheriff is matters. Who your police chief is or superintendent of schools matters. Who your congressman, your congresswoman, or president matters. And that's an awesome power. So speaking of congresspeople, I am so pleased today to be able to introduce to you Representative Don Beyer, who represents the people of the 8th District of Virginia. He, before taking his seat in Congress, was the lieutenant governor. He's also been ambassador to both Switzerland and Liechtenstein. And before coming into public office, he chaired for roughly 14 years jobs for Virginia graduates, which had a very successful rate of preventing student dropouts. So since coming into office, he has put a number of good proposals out there as well, including the PROVE Act, which would pre-register 16-year-olds to vote. And so clearly, this is a government official who has your back. So Representative Beyer, please come on up.
Thank you very much. It's terrific. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I was thrilled to be asked to be part of this, even though I thought it was a little weird to invite a 66-year-old to come talk about millennials voting. I do have 4 children, 3 of whom are millennials. And we've tried to raise them right. The only one that's tiny bit famous is my 24-year-old Clara, who started the Twitter account Feminist Taylor Swift. So if any of you follow that, that's my major claim to fame. And she's a good voter. I was asked briefly to talk about the PROVE Act, which is the bill that we introduced to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to pre-register to vote. There's a lot of, not much research on what actually happens when people pre-register. But the idea is that years ago when I was lieutenant governor, I was leading the fight in Virginia for motor voter registration. That when you showed up to get your license or to get new license plates, you could register to vote then and there. The governor at the time was Republican Governor George Allen, who fought it the whole time until the courts overruled him. So we won, which was great. But it only really makes sense now for somebody 18 and older. And yet most of us get our driver's license at 15 and a half, at 16, a learner's and then the thing. So the idea was, let's make it when you apply for your license at 16, when you turn 18, you actually are registered to vote already. It's a good idea. I wasn't even really aware of it until I saw a Center for American Progress report titled The Health of state democracies that ranked all the states in terms of how good their voter registration is. And good old Virginia was 50th out of 51st. Washington, D.C. is in that mix. We were ahead of Alabama and behind Tennessee. So that was a little upsetting. And when you look deeper into it, the reason was because we were not one of the states that allowed pre-registration. So we looked, and I'm not in the Virginia Assembly, so we looked at the other places. So you have California, Massachusetts, Hawaii, the District of Columbia allows 16 and 17-year-olds to pre-register. Up to 20 allows 17-year-olds to pre-register. And there's also very little effort nationally in trying to do civic education around voter registration. In fact, one of the things we see in the wake of the Great Recession is the first thing gets eliminated from curricula in high schools are the arts. And the next thing are civics. So you have less and less civics going on. So we've tried to get as many co-sponsors for this bill as possible. We have a couple of dozen Democrats. We've invited every single Republican. So far, nobody's on board. And that's unfortunate because voting is good for everyone. The dilemma with the Republicans is they often fear that it will be a disadvantage for them to have young people vote. I don't necessarily think that's true. I mean, young people are pretty independent thinking, but so far it's no good. Frequently asked questions. The Approve Act costs nothing. It doesn't cost any more to register people at 16 than it does at 18. We do put $25 million in through the Election Assistance Commission, a federal thing, to do grants to states to actually do civics, to teach young people about why it's important. It doesn't affect the legal voting age. This is the 26th Amendment. It's still 18. Does it have any long-term benefits? Probably the best one is that people that are used to voting vote. People that haven't voted don't vote. So voting is very habit-forming. Some of you I know have probably knocked on doors and you have street sheets. I've been dealing with street sheets for a long time. And the coolest part of looking at a street sheet is you see a guy named Mike Lucier, and you look at his voting history. Yeah, there's some that vote every 4 years. There's some that vote every 2 years. There's some that vote in every single primary, every single general election. I'm still feeling bad that I missed a Vienna Town Council election in May of 1991. I'm still consumed with guilt about it. And I'm mad because nobody put any literature on my doorstep or knocked on my door. And if I look at my children now, who are 41, 36, 24, 21, you look at their records as every primary and every general. Mostly because I got the whip out. But I also want it to be a deep habit. The old that habit leads to character and character is destiny. So let me shift and say, well, why does this matter? Three big things. Number one, there are a lot of close elections in the world. If you go to Wikipedia right now, you can see many, most of them seem to be in Canada, but whatever. I just think in my own experience, Lyndon Johnson, not quite my experience, 1948, he was elected to the U.S. Senate by 87 votes in Texas and went on to become Majority Leader, Vice President, President of the United States. Mark Herring, Virginia's current Attorney General, was losing after the opening thing. They did the recount, and he won by 323 votes. Well, he has been the most dynamic Attorney General in Virginia history. Came out right away for marriage equality and refused to defend the folks that were suing on it. We ended up overturning the law, giving marriage equality in Virginia. He's the one that stood up for the Dreamers, that they should get state tuitions in Virginia at UVA and Tech and James Madison and places. He has just been a really powerful, symbolic, and functional Attorney General, all by 323 votes out of 2 million. George Allen, I mentioned George, with whom I served, a Republican governor. We're good friends, although we agreed on very little. He won by 5 votes when he was elected to the Virginia General Assembly. Dale remembers from Charlottesville. For the lack of 5 people, we could have had a completely different Virginia history. Probably my best example is my good friend Lindsay West, who was chairman of the Montgomery County Board of Supervisors in Virginia, which is where Virginia Tech is, Christiansburg and Blacksburg. So she's the incumbent chair of the Board of Supervisors. It was a close election. They did a recount, and it was a tie. And the Virginia Constitution says you flip a coin, and she lost the coin toss and was then out of office. You guys are probably familiar with the so-called Muhlenberg legend, which says that for lack of 1 vote, German would have been the official language of the United States of America. Now, it's actually a legend because that's not actually what happened. Because there is no official language in the United States even now. But in 1794, the Speaker of the House, the U.S. House, was a guy named Muhlenberg of German ancestry. And there was a petition to have all of the bills on the House floor translated into English and into German. And the petition failed. It was 41-41, and the German-speaking speaker voted no. So by one vote, we don't translate the laws in. So heute sprechen wir Deutsch zusammen. No, we don't. But only because we were lucky that one vote. Number two, the things that you care about, at least that I guess you care about. I asked my kids, will Social Security be there for them? And they think no. I mean, it's sort of, accepted wisdom that millennials don't believe they'll have Social Security. College debt, $17,000 average for undergraduates that have college debt. Job prospects. The most popular part of the Obamacare is that you can stay on your parents' insurance till 26. Because when I was running for Congress 2 years ago, the best line was, I promise to get your kid out of your basement. All the tech things that you guys care about, net neutrality, et cetera. And then just money in politics. I'm so pleased that Common Cause is sponsoring this, but money in politics is an enormous effort. When I was overseas, we would talk about corruption in Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, and they'd say, yeah, what about Citizens United? What about the Koch brothers? They'd throw it right back on our face. These are all things I believe millennials care deeply about, but if you don't vote, you don't count. You're irrelevant. And so anything you can do to get young people to vote. And then the last thing, Robert Samuelson for the Washington Post has written about this very well again and again, is that our overall political structure heavily tilts towards taking care of old people. We don't do entitlement reform in the Congress, Democrats or Republicans, because we're afraid people over 65 aren't going to vote for us, maybe even people over 55. So we spend a lot more time worrying about preserving retirement ages and preserving Medicare benefits than we do about college debt, than we do about job prospects, than we do about how you can be entrepreneurs. 2014, 14% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted. 57% of 65 to 74-year-olds voted. Whopping difference. That's just of registered. By the way, there are many more registered old people than there are registered young people. When I was running for the primary in 2014, there were 13 of us in there. We did the math and said that the average primary voter is a 62-year-old woman. And so our efforts were heavily tilted toward older people because we knew that they were the ones that were going to show up. So if you care about, I know you care about the things you care about, but if you want to make a difference, if you believe that politics can be an effective force in your lives, you just have to show up. And we'll do everything we can to get the PROVE Act passed. We might need a different composition of the Congress or me to be more persuasive with my Republican friends. But we will be relentless and we will push forward. And thank you for letting an old person start off your conference today. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yep. So I am Ari Berman. I cover voting rights for The Nation and for other places, and I'm author of the book Give Us the Ballot, and I am honored to moderate this great panel that we have here. And I want to thank Common Cause for hosting this and for, do you have the report? Does anyone have the report? And for producing the great report that marks this occasion. And let me flag it for a second. So, and I can say that I get a lot of these reports sent to me, and they're usually pretty boring, and there's not a lot of interesting information. This one, however, has lots of great information, is really interesting. There's lots of really cool boxes and charts that you can tweet later. So I urge you guys to check this out. So we'll put it there and come back to it later. And I want to start in somewhat millennial fashion with a quiz. Not a quiz, but a trivia question, which is that whoever answers this question correctly will get a copy of my book. And this is for students only. So do you guys know when the 26th Amendment giving 18-year-olds the right to vote was ratified? Don't look at your phones. Anybody? 1971. Okay. Yes, you're correct. Okay, come see me later. We'll give you a book. So I say this because I think that the struggle for youth voting rights is a key part of voting rights history, but is often not acknowledged as such. And when you think about it, young people played a huge role in the voting rights struggle and a huge role in civil rights history. Martin Luther King was just 26 years old when he helped lead the Montgomery bus boycott. It was people like John Lewis and Diane Nash and Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schwerner and James Chaney, who were just in their 20s, who died or nearly died fighting and marching for the right to vote. So all of you guys are a key part of this history. And when the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, it got rid of things like literacy tests and poll taxes that had prevented so many people, including so many young people, from voting. But after 1965, the voting rights struggle didn't end. In fact, the passage of the Voting Rights Act just led to another chapter in the struggle for voting rights. And one really interesting part of the Voting Rights Act was it was temporary. Parts of the Voting Rights Act had to be renewed. And the first renewal of the Voting Rights Act came in 1970 when Richard Nixon was president. And Nixon famously helped lead the Southern strategy. He was trying to court conservative white Southerners, and he wasn't that crazy about the Voting Rights Act. And when the Voting Rights Act came up for reauthorization before the Congress, the Nixon administration tried to gut the Voting Rights Act. But what was interesting is there was a very strong bipartisan movement in the Congress to not only reauthorize the Voting Rights Act, but to strengthen it. And Ted Kennedy introduced an amendment that lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, which gave 11 million people the right to vote. That was then signed by Richard Nixon in 1970. What happened was the Supreme Court ruled that that amendment to the Voting Rights Act applied only to federal elections. So then the 26th Amendment was passed that gave the right to vote for 18-year-olds in all elections, state and federal elections, which then allowed 11 million people to be able to vote for the first time. And basically what Ted Kennedy and many others said was, if you were old enough to fight in Vietnam, you should be old enough to be able to vote. So I think that's a really critical part of American history that's often ignored. And we see that young voters have been a key part of presidential elections and other elections in recent years, that young voters were a key part of what they call the coalition of the ascendant that helped lead to Barack Obama's presidency in 2008. And just yesterday, Hillary Clinton gave a speech aimed at millennials, which we're going to talk more about, which she talked about things like making college more affordable and overturning Citizens United, and talked a little bit more personally about the issues and the people that have inspired her in her life. But the problem is that even when turnout among millennials is high, like in 2008, only 50% of eligible young voters are voting. So people are not voting at the numbers that we'd like to see. And then when they do vote, there's often a backlash. And that's what we saw after 2008, that when young voters came out in record numbers, there were all of these new efforts introduced to make it harder to vote, whether making it harder to register to vote, or cutting back on the amount of time that people had to vote, or requiring strict forms of ID that millions of people didn't have. And just quickly want to go through what some of those things were. In Texas, for example, you could vote with a gun permit, but not a student ID. In Wisconsin, according to a federal trial, Republican legislators behind closed doors were, quote, giddy about the effect that their state's voter ID law would have on college campuses and neighborhoods around Milwaukee, they said. In North Carolina, the executive director of the state's Republican Party just explicitly called for prohibiting polling places on college campuses. This is what he said: "No group of people are entitled to their own early voting site, including college students who already have more voting options than most other citizens." So we're unfortunately seeing lots of different efforts in a bunch of different states to make it harder for students to vote that we're going to get into more on this panel. We also see that efforts to make it easier to vote have been particularly beneficial to young voters. So just a month after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, North Carolina, for example, didn't just require strict voter ID. They cut back on early voting. They eliminated same-day voter registration. They eliminated pre-registration, which the congressman talked about, for 16 and 17-year-olds. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, in a really remarkable opinion, found that this law targeted black voters with almost surgical precision. But the effect on young voters was also really dramatic, and this is laid out in the Common Cause report. Half of young people in North Carolina voted early. In North Carolina, young voters were 9% of the electorate, but 20% of those who used same-day voter registration, who showed up, registered, and voted at the same time. 160,000 North Carolinians used pre-registration from 2010 to 2013. So we see when states make it easier to vote, that has a particularly beneficial effect on young voters. And the last thing I'll say before we get to the panel is my first election was the 2000 election in Florida, which was a very eye-opening experience in terms of how American democracy worked, or in this case, didn't work. And we heard a lot at the time about hanging chads and butterfly ballots and Katherine Harris and some elderly Jewish voters mistakenly voting for Pat Buchanan in Palm Beach. But when I later researched the 2000 election in Florida for my book, what I realized was there was a lot more at play here. That the state did this massive purge of voters in the run-up to the election. Florida was one of only a few states that prevented ex-felons from being able to vote. And we know now that these kind of felon disenfranchisement laws prevent 6 million people from being able to vote. But Florida did this massive purge. They claimed that all of these felons were illegally on the voting rolls and needed to be purged. The problem was, first, that the list was discriminatory. People were labeled felons even if they were not. And the list was inaccurate and it was discriminatory, that in Florida, African Americans, for example, were 11% of registered voters, but 44% of those on the voter purge list. So people, longtime voters, first-time voters, showed up on election day in Florida. They were wrongly purged from the voting rolls and prevented from voting. After the 2000 election, the NAACP sued the state of Florida, and the state admitted that 12,000 people were wrongly purged from the voting rolls and prevented from voting. That was 22 times George W. Bush's margin of victory. And I say this, number one, to tell you guys, this election was decided by 537 votes. So if you don't think your vote matters, just look at what happened in Florida. And not only that, it was voter suppression that more than likely decided the outcome. So if you don't think that these things matter, particularly in close elections, pay attention to what happened in Florida, pay attention to what's described in this report. So I want to get into all of these issues with this really extremely great panel we have and all of these students we have. Since this is the 21st century, on Skype or whatever they're on. We're going to get to you guys soon. Hello. But just to reintroduce everyone briefly, starting on my far right, which is not a political connotation, we have Yael Bromberg, who is staff attorney at the Institute for Public Representation at Georgetown University Law Center. Next to her is Brianna Ross. She is vice president of the United States Student Association. Next to me is Allegra Chapman. She is director of voting and elections at Common Cause. I should mention that Allegra and Yael co-authored this report. To my left, which is maybe a more accurate political description, is Michelle Jawando, who is vice president of legal progress at the Center for American Progress. And to her left is Cliff Kang, who is co-founder of Polinav, an app dedicated to giving citizens an easy way to get involved in the political process, which is always good to see. And then we have students at UC Berkeley, Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, University of Michigan, and North Carolina. What? North Carolina Central University. So they're all here. Hello, everybody. We'll get to you guys in a second. So I want to start with you, Brianna, since you have your finger on the pulse of this generation. Just talk to me. You just had a big conference recently with a lot of different students. Talk to me about the issues that are in people's minds. What are the issues, and do they feel like they're being addressed in this campaign?
Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I would say the thing that's really interesting is with this election, I'm sure as you all know, youth voters, specifically college students, are not excited about either of the candidates, especially when you're comparing it to when Barack Obama was running for president. So specifically with the issues that college students that we've noticed as we're on the ground mobilizing these folks care about is not just free public college. One of the things that I've noticed is from both parties, what has been the most popular way for folks to attract youth voters has been talking about higher education. But one of the things I do want to emphasize that beyond higher education accessibility, beyond financial aid and things of that sort, that a lot of youth voters really do care about comprehensive immigration reform. They do care about climate justice. They care about police accountability and the demilitarization of campus police. And I think that's something that is really, really important to emphasize, and that I've noticed that both political parties have covered, maybe not in depth, but specifically, college has been the main thing that has been addressed, which I feel like it has been addressed pretty well by both political parties. But specifically, I noticed when it comes to issues pertaining to the Black Lives Matter movement and police accountability and demilitarization of campus police, that has been something that at the beginning at the beginning of everything was really, really big, but has not necessarily been something that has been addressed in the depth and the breadth that people have wanted it to. I know comprehensive immigration reform has been touched on and has been something that has been very divisive among both political parties, but students don't just want to hear, oh, I believe in comprehensive immigration reform. There's no timeline or method in which that is going to be addressed. And also, there's no actual depth of how students are being approached in this election. So I believe that one of the things that really needs to be focused on is having a more intersectional approach. As you know, millennials make up 33% of the electorate, and we are no longer the marginalized or underrepresented community, but we're becoming the new American majority. So the way in which students are being addressed does not need to be solely on free higher education, and even if free higher education was made a reality tomorrow, we still have a large generation of folks that are directly impacted by student debt, and I think that's something that needs to be a lot more addressed by both presidential candidates.
Okay, great. I want to go to one of the students on the video screen at Gettysburg College. Are you guys there? Can you raise your hand if you can hear me? Okay, they're here. They're here. So they're behind me, but I'm looking at them. So hi, guys.
Hi.
So Hillary was just in your state, so I want to go to you guys first. So she gave this speech at Temple, which was aimed at millennials, and I want to know, first off, did you guys watch it, and what did you think? And then also, the polling is interesting about with young voters. Basically, Trump is unbelievably unpopular with young people. 83% of young voters have a negative impression of Trump, which is higher than any other demographic group. But they're not that crazy about Hillary either. Hillary is only getting 41% of the youth vote, according to a McClatchy poll, which is well below what President Obama got in 2008 and 2012. And a third of young voters say they're going to vote third party for either Gary Johnson or Jill Stein. So I was hoping you guys could speak to this. If Hillary is not connecting on college campuses, why is she not connecting? What issues are the two major candidates not talking about that they could be talking about? And do people really know anything about Gary Johnson and Jill Stein, or they just like them because they're not Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton?
Well, first of all,
We can't hear you.
yeah, can you hear us?
Yes,
Better.
yes.
Great. I was saying that I do think that you're accurate in saying that there are millennials who don't really feel like either of the candidates accurately portray what their belief of the future is. And I think particularly at Gettysburg, we have a large immigrant population around us, so we do see the firsthand impacts that they're facing. So going based off of that, neither candidate is really willing to put their stance out in a confirmatory way to say these are the actions that we're willing to take. So I think it's just basically our needs don't feel met. I know that Gary Johnson and Jill Stein are actually really big on our campus, and a lot of students are planning on voting third party, which is great in the fact that they are looking for other political candidates and they're doing that outreach. However, that also splits the vote, and not everyone is educated in that way. So I think just basic education on like filling out absentee ballots and all of that, that's where we really get the problem of educating the millennials and being able to carry it out in a way that our government allows us.
Okay, we're going to come back to the students in a second, but I want to go to you, Allegra. So one of the things that was really interesting about the report, and you guys had a great chart about this, is that 15 states have strict voter ID laws, and in 7 of those states, student ID laws are not accepted for voting, which I think is extremely alarming because these are government-issued IDs in many cases that are not being accepted. Can you talk about what impact things like that are going to have and other barriers like that you found in the report?
Yeah, that's right, Ari. We find it really troubling. Going to the Texas example, which you already mentioned, I mean, it's really worrisome that you can go in so long as you have a gun license, but even if you're enrolled in an academy of higher education, that is not going to suffice. And to your point too, like these are government issued IDs. When you're enrolling at a college or university, you're not just showing up on day one with nothing. Like enrollment requires a lot of paperwork. It requires a lot of proof. By virtue of showing up there and enrolling, you're definitely already providing all the documentation that's needed in order to get a valid identification that should get you to vote if you're in a state where they're going to put into place one of those photo IDs in the first place. I mean, but that just goes to the problem of photo ID in general, whether it be the kinds that keep students from voting or really anybody. And that was a problem that we saw. You do such a great job of this in your book after Obama got elected in 2010, but then again after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County versus Holder, where half the country was putting through these measures, these strict photo ID laws that were keeping a lot of people from the ballot box, people of color, students, people with disabilities, the elderly. And what's coming out now, the courts have taken up these issues, and because there's been a lot of really good litigation on it, including some students participated in litigation in North Carolina. North Carolina had probably one of the worst, everybody was calling it like the monster bill. So it's like one of the worst vote suppression bills in the country. It slashed same-day registration, slashed early voting, slashed pre-registration, which, as we've been talking about, is one of these things that really kind of instills the habit of voting for younger people, and then put into place this onerous photo ID law. And the legislators essentially knew when they were putting this into place that this was going to have an impact on the student vote. This was like fleshed out during hearings. People talked it out, and they basically put this law into effect knowing that it was going to keep younger people from showing up and voting. And yeah, I mean, when it comes to sort of like the practical effect of this, I mean, one, we don't think any state needs a photo ID in place to begin with, whether it's targeting students or anybody for that matter. I mean, the reality is, and this is what the courts are finding, is that voter fraud simply does not exist to the degree requiring a photo ID, that this is in essence a sham. And even when you hear courts like the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is arguably the most conservative court in the country, or one of them, saying the same thing, then you know that this is a political maneuver. So then when it comes to practical purposes, I mean, you can imagine being a first-time student. Like, how many people here are actually freshmen? Probably, okay, one. All right, two, a few, okay. So let's say you move from, a different state. You're coming to DC. It's September. You get here August, September. The election is a couple months away. The first thing on your mind is, I got to go to the DMV, or I've got to go to, whatever other agency in order to get an ID, because I know that a student ID or my ID from back home is not going to work. And I use DC as the example, but there is no photo ID law in DC, so rest assured. But that's not going to be at the front of your mind when you're coming to a new place and a new school. You're here, you're trying to find an apartment, you're trying to make friends, you're going to classes, you're getting your books, and then all of a sudden, this registration deadline, which is typically in most places 30 days out from the election, looms upon you. So this really has a disenfranchising effect.
Yeah, but Yael, I want to go to you because there have been some success stories too. I mean, I don't want everyone to just walk out if you're depressed feeling like they're not going to be able to vote, because litigation in a number of different states, whether it's Texas or North Carolina, has been effective. So can you talk about the role that young people have played in this litigation, either in terms of being plaintiffs or supporting the litigation or helping raise awareness about it?
Yeah, well, young people have been very active in recognizing the voter suppression that they've been, the subject of. In North Carolina, they were lead plaintiffs. In Tennessee, where, by the way, you could vote with a faculty ID issued by university, but not with a student ID issued by the same university. They were involved as plaintiffs as well. And they are pushing back. And what we're finding is that, as you said, there were 15 states in the country that have strict voter IDs laws in place, which means that you are required to show an ID in order to have your vote validated. And if you don't show it at the polls, then you have to do it after the election, during the election count. And that has a specific impact on students. But in addition to that, there are several states across the country that will not accept out-of-state government-issued identifications, which specifically impacts students that move to other states as well. And when you combine those two kind of layers of states, you end up with 6 states that accept neither. And so there has more recently this summer been successful litigation. But again, that is at the risk of all of the elections that have been implemented in the meantime in order for the courts to actually be able to have trials, to have it bubble up, for public opinion to really come together to say, no, these photo ID laws are restrictive. And it's not just photo ID, it's rollbacks to pre-registration programs, rollbacks to early voting, rollbacks to same-day registration opportunities. And the truth is that these restrictive pieces wouldn't be put into place unless they were effective. And in North Carolina, they were actually particularly effective in North Carolina, being among the top in the country for voter turnout and coming up. And as a result of that, that's when they started to put these laws into place. Mm-hmm. And so the Fourth Circuit recently found that the omnibus bill in North Carolina had a discriminatory intent and struck it down. In Texas, they found it had a discriminatory effect, and now it's going to go back for a trial on the intent prong. In Wisconsin, they invalidated the photo ID measure, and now it's up for appeal to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. And what we're just finding, just to kind of wrap up this point, is that these bills that have been put into place post 2008 election and post Shelby are really direct descendants of the bills that were and efforts that were struck down through the 1970s after the 26th Amendment was first ratified. And so what we're finding is that the courts are starting to recognize this. They're starting to come to terms with this, but it's really been a result of building public opinion around this issue as well and saying, no, voter fraud does not exist and photo ID is not related to voter fraud.
Since we talked about North Carolina, I want to go to one of the students in North Carolina. Rebecca, are you there? Is that Rebecca?
My name's Elisa. I'm representing North Carolina.
Okay, sorry, we have a different student than's listed on the bio, but just, can you introduce yourself again?
Yes, my name is Elisa Harvey. I'm a senior political science major.
Okay, great. So can you talk about now that North Carolina has restored things like early voting and same-day voter registration? Do you think this is going to make it easier for young people to be able to vote? Have your friends been aware of the struggle over voting rights in North Carolina? Has this motivated people to get more active?
I think students are becoming more active with this election, particularly being a presidential election, and they were not as aware of how strict the voting laws were last year for the local elections. And the registration that we have been doing has been more effective. We have been going up in numbers of registering students, and students are more likely to vote this year.
Okay, got it. Thank you. We'll come back to more students in a little bit. Michelle, let's go to you. So there's been some interesting articles recently about Black millennials, who I think we've seen have been very, very active in things like Black Lives Matter. No one can accuse them of apathy when it comes to civil rights. At the same time, we see that there seems to be dissatisfaction among Black millennials with the two major candidates, and dissatisfaction with Hillary Clinton for things that happened in the 1990s and afterwards. So can you talk about sort of the issues they care about, Black Lives Matter, for example, and how you can make the connection between that and voting being part of the solution as opposed to being part of the problem?
So first off, I just want to thank Allegra and the amazing team over at Common Cause for putting this on. I think it is as important to recognize the power of millennials. I think sometimes there is a narrative that is put out that your engagement is either not welcome or is not as engaged as previous generations. But if we look at the data in 1976, this is during the Nixon era, we saw that registration for boomers at that time, who would have been 18 to 35, was about the same, was about at 51%. But in 2008, as Ari mentioned, millennial engagement was 50%. So we see comparable turnout for millennials back in the 70s as well as seeing it today. The problem writ large is that we can't move it past that 50% threshold. The reason why it is, I think, particularly acute for African Americans and for communities of color is that the same way we live our lives, and there's this great Jesse Jackson quote, when America has a cold, African Americans have a flu. And the reason, and that's probably why I'm nasal today, but the reason that it's so important for us to think, and I appreciate my sister from USSA to talk about intersectionality, is that when we think about things like voter ID, your first conversation or the first thing you may think about is just in the bucket of voting rights. So I don't have the correct information that I need in order to go and vote. So what does that mean next? Well, if you live in a state like Texas that had an incredibly restrictive voter ID provision, you also were in a state that had one of the worst opportunities or access to reproductive justice and health. And whatever clinics that were established here, the courts in those states closed them earlier in the year, disproportionately again in lower income and communities of color. So for so many people, the place where they had health care, access, that was shut down. They couldn't use any ID that they had to go and vote. And so what does that then do if you are a 22, 23-year-old young woman, your ID you can't use to go vote, your healthcare center in your community has been shut down, and all of your rights keep on going before the courts, as if somehow your rights should be litigated every single day. The problem with kind of the frame, and I am so grateful for so many of our friends in the voting rights community, we talk about their role, but it has to be said that they're spending millions of dollars fighting for accessibility that we should not have to fight for. And so when our rights are constantly litigated before the courts, and that's why I spend a lot of time also talking about the Supreme Court, and don't get me started about the Supreme Court in this election. Like, I think it is so clear because I and my family don't want to be kicked out of the country. I don't want a wall. I don't want my cousins who are Muslim to get religious tested. Yeah, there's some real issues here, but I'm going to try to keep that inside today and stay nonpartisan. But the reason why litigation is not enough, the reason why we have to think about proactive measures is because disproportionately all of these methods to keep certain communities out fall on the backs of communities of color, disproportionately not under-resourced communities, and also not having the same political power and access. I think it's so important also for us to think about our role in voting in the primaries. Young people often don't recognize that the primaries, even for whether you're talking about progressives or conservatives, the frame on which you attack issues often happens in the primaries. So you heard the congressman talk about during the primaries, who did he target his literature to? Who remembers? 64-year-old woman. So then if you can't even get a great progressive Democrat to focus on the issues that disproportionately are affecting you as millennials, whether it's student debt, whether it's police accountability, then how can we shift the conversations that need to happen at the highest levels? So while I do agree that there is a disconnect, I think, in this election, it is because we often walk into these conversations with this negative frame that all is lost. Well, I resoundingly reject that because there is so much that we can do, and some of it is just as simple as connecting with our networks and making sure that I have one or two friends, that we have a plan, and it's so important to have a plan on how you're going to go and vote, and making sure your cousin back home also has a plan and they're bringing one or two people with them.
But I just want to go back. I just want to press you a little bit more on this because you hear this a lot, which is, the differences between the candidates, right? People will say, people who care a lot about civil rights issues today will say, well, look at how many prisons were built under Bill Clinton. Look at mass incarceration under Bill Clinton. Look at what happened in Baltimore, where African-American Democrats were in charge of the city when Freddie Gray was murdered.
That's right.
So, and then they say, what does it matter? The system is the system. It's going to stay the way it is. So while nodding to that, how do then, when you're talking, how do you break through and say, okay, the system is the system, but if certain people get in there and voting is the first step in that, then the system may start to change?
So I think there are a few things. So I am authentically 100% a Black woman, right? I claim my space. If you look at my Twitter handle, I say I'm raising 3 warrior women, my husband and I, to be as awoke and conscious as we possibly can be. What I have recognized is that there are 2 things that are happening in this election. One, we have never seen women's leadership at this level. And the reason why I think that that is important, if you think about the fact that there are only about 5 women who are CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, and it is 2016, we as a country are still grappling with the way that we look at and we examine women. And I thought something that you said as you posed the question to me, Ari, was during Bill Clinton's presidency, this is what happened. During Bill Clinton's presidency, this is what happened. Hillary Clinton, and again, I'm here in my own personal capacity, and I'll try to answer this question with that frame. There is a message and a plan that she is putting out that is forthcoming, but yet the sins of her husband, in some ways, are accounted to her. And I think that's because, again, as a country, we are still grappling with what leadership in a woman individually looks like. Now, that is not to say that we can't call her out and ask for greater accountability. And I think accountability is what was missing in Ferguson, what was missing in Baltimore. If you are not raising these questions, and that's why I think it's important that we ask these questions, she will give you a 10-point platform and plan. But it can't be just the plan, and it can't be just once you're in there, what will happen. What happens is because we call the question. We force us to move the conversation forward. When Bernie Sanders went and spoke at Netroots, it was my girlfriend Tia Oso who questioned and challenged her about what her plan was about Black Lives Matter. And then 5 days later, you saw Simone Sanders in a racial justice platform presented. That is what accountability looks like. And I think often we take our foot off the pedal. We get the people that we care about and we stop asking them. That's why I think in some ways the Dreamer movement was incredibly powerful to push the president to move on executive action, because it was like, listen, I want him in the White House, but you know what, I'm gonna push him till I get what I want. And I think that there's a question of accountability. We often feel like the democracy exists without us. And in fact, it only works with us and calling for these questions.
So Cliff, one of the things you're trying to do is to get young people more involved in the political process by just making the political process more accessible to them. So can you talk about what you're doing with your app, and also how we can just leverage technology in general to make the political process more accessible?
Thanks to Common Cause for inviting me. But so what we're trying to do is to make politics something that's accessible for younger people. And that's why, like, right now we are partnering with like student governments at different colleges, so that we are kind of targeting that population. And hopefully we will be talking with George Washington pretty soon as well. But like what we do is we provide summaries of legislation, because as much as registering people to vote is important, it's like, I think the bigger reason why students might not be engaging with politics is because they just don't understand it. So like that's why for us it was about, yes, voter registration is important, accessibility is important, but how do we actually get them to understand it? And how do we be on a platform that young people are actually using? So that's why I was like, we can't focus on a web platform. We have to be on mobile phones, where currently I believe it's like above 90% penetration within the millennial population has smartphones. So, and we're on it constantly. You guys probably saw me on it earlier, but yeah, like we want to be on the place where millennials were actually being, and also be a very like modern type of platform that has good design. Because as much as people my age like want to be informed per se, if it doesn't look good, then they'll also not want to share it with their friends. It has that whole sense where if they're going to share it with somebody, then they want to be proud of it. But if it looks like a Web 1.0 type of application, then students aren't going to want to share it because then they'll be embarrassed. So for us, it was all about how do we break down all these different kinds of barriers where students feel like they're unable to engage with politics. Like for another thing that we're building is an algorithm where we're able to cater bills towards you. So instead of our big ask for students and for just the general public is going to be let us show you a bill that you're probably going to care about, instead of you having to think about every day that this is the kind of bill that I want to engage with. But instead, it's going to be, our ask is going to be, let's engage with politics today, and we'll show you something that you're more likely to be interested in. And when you come to our platform, it's going to be a few bullet points to help you understand what the bill is about, and a few points about what the different sides are saying. So you can make a quick decision on how you want your representative to vote. So, yeah.
Thanks, Cliff. I want to go to the students in California. You guys here? Can you hear me? Yes?
Hear you.
You can hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. You guys are at Berkeley, right?
Yes.
Hi. So going off what Cliff said, when California adopted online voter registration, for example, 800,000 people registered within a few months, and a third of them were under 25, which was in the report. And so I was hoping you could talk about how things like online registration are making it easier for students to participate. California next year is going to have automatic registration, so if you get a license, you're going to be automatically registered to vote. So can you talk about the impact that's having there?
Okay, well, thank you for all this great information. And yeah, Common Cause, when it passed online voter registration, 200,000 young students registered to vote in the first year. And we also did same-day registration as well as motor voter, which was automatic registration. And right now we have the Secretary of State who is working with the UCs to get registration on campuses. And AB 245 is the bill that we're trying to get the governor to pass, and it could actually implement permanent legislation to have registration on UC campuses. Also, we're doing a dorm storm, which is knocking on students' dormitories to get them involved, as well as holding events with the student government. And currently we are working on Measure X1, which is to get public financing into Berkeley politics. And I'm helping work as a captain on Thursdays to get students working out in the fields. And yeah, I'm sorry that a lot of the students had to leave today because they had to go to class.
Okay. Chris, I want to go to you at University of Michigan. You're here with us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. So Michigan is getting a lot of attention in the campaign, so I was hoping you could talk about the issues that are resonating in Michigan, and also just talk a little bit about local politics. There's been so much coverage of Flint, for example. But a lot of young people don't vote in local elections, whether it's deciding who the governor is going to be or who the people that are actually going to control the water supply in places like Flint. So talk about the issues that are resonating now, but also just talk about the fact that are young people paying attention to Flint and saying, hey, these local races matter too?
I think especially in Michigan, local races have become really important, especially with the issues surrounding Flint and how we govern and how we manage municipalities. Flint was such a disaster. I think a lot of youth understand how important it is to make sure that voters have oversight over what elected officials are doing. and ultimately like decisions that they make and how that can.
Oh, we just lost you. Chris, I think we lost your audio. Okay, well, we'll come back. We'll come back to you. I think we have to open it up for questions in a second. I just really quickly want to go through to all of the panelists and just ask you something very briefly. If there's one issue that you think is really important that hasn't really been raised in depth in the campaign, what is it and what would you like to hear the candidates talk about? Yeah, we'll start with you.
Oh, one issue that has not been raised,
Yeah.
I would say police brutality and police accountability.
I would say corporate interests. Beyond Citizens United, also like the Koch brothers coming on college campuses and how the corporatization of higher education is impacting college students.
We've heard one candidate talk about it, but not both. And this is the issue of democracy reform. And, you know, I'm not sure actually the last time, Hillary Clinton has definitely been talking about the need to improve registration, like automatic voter registration and a number of other things, early voting that would really allow for greater accessibility and hopefully like bump up the turnout to above 60%, which is what we get on a good day. But I haven't heard much talk about the need to really restore the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. And I really would like to hear not only the two candidates, but all four, and particularly our members of Congress to talk about this too, because you know, it was really after we lost the really strong protections of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act that we saw this flooding of onerous measures just reach cross country. You know, states that weren't even covered by the Voting Rights Act, I think just emboldened by like these other states that had been covered, you know, really kind of took the initiative after seeing these others, aha, I can do this too. So I think we need to bring that back in place and restore a little bit more order.
I would say there's one candidate who has talked extensively about kind of paid family medical leave and what that means. There's another candidate who I don't think understands that. And then there are two other candidates that I haven't heard anything about. So I think that talking about what that means at some point in our lives, each of us gets sick, we need to take care of our families, and we may want to have children. And I think it's incredibly important to see where people are on that.
For me, I think it would be just a simplified Congress. The ability to know what's coming up on the calendar, the ability for people to understand bills by having a bill being about one subject.
Yeah.
Things like that. So.
I would just add that it's crazy to me that there's a vacant Supreme Court seat right now.
188
at this
days.
very moment, and it's not being discussed. How is this not one of the most central issues of the presidential campaign? And everything that we talk about, all of these issues are going to come before the Supreme Court, whether it's criminal justice or voting rights or climate change or immigration. Many of these things have already come before the courts. They're coming before the courts again. And I think it's really, really, really important that younger voters who are voting for the first time or the second time, realizing they're not just voting for one candidate for 4 years. They're voting for 2 or 3 justices for the next 30 to 40 years.
That's right.
And if that's not a reason to vote with a vacant seat right now, I'm not really sure what more you could try to do to try to mobilize someone. But let's open it up for questions, both either for the panelists or the people that are still with us virtually as well. Do we have a mic for them? Yep. Okay. Okay. In the front row first.
All right. Thank you all for the really dynamic and engaging panel. I enjoyed all of it. I kind of want to touch on the last question you just brought up when you all went out and said, what's an issue that hasn't been brought up? Yeah. And I think it's important to talk about, you know, the context of the two candidates in the election. But I think there's also a deeper problem beyond just what are the issues. I think that there's a larger cynicism with the entire political system. I think that it's not as easy as Hillary or Trump giving a speech on police brutality. I think that there are a lot of millennials that don't believe they'll see results even if there is a speech. I think that a lot of people bought into the Barack Obama, the hope and change, and so much of our political system is based on slow progress. It's based on compromise. And when you think about these big issues that millennials care about, global warming, climate change, criminal justice reform, money in politics, these are big problems that need big solutions that people want to see faster results on. So I think that one of the components, you brought it up in one of the questions about just like losing belief in the system itself, but I'd like to see the panel speak more about that, and especially since the theme here is about these are millennials that are engaged. They're the ones that are showing up to protests but aren't showing up to the ballot, and that's because they don't believe the ballot is a solution. So I just want to hear what your thoughts are in how we tackle this greater systematic cynicism and not just what are the issues that can cater to what we're interested in hearing
You
about.
want to go to? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Brianna, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I definitely agree. I think the problem's a little bit bigger in the sense that it's more of a distrust in institutions and also the candidates, regardless of how people may identify, whether it's Democrat, Republican, or independent. People just don't trust what the different candidates and what the different parties are putting forward. I know specifically the Democratic Party has put forward one of its most progressive party platforms in years, but I would say millennials, even more specifically college students, don't just want a policy platform. They want action and they want change. So I think more specifically, when we're talking about the election, yes, it's important to vote, registering to vote, but also getting out the vote, but we need to organize. This is a really unique opportunity in this election to really educate folks and politicize them around different issues that are going on right now. But beyond November 8th, regardless of who gets elected, we're still going to have to organize. We have that reauthorization of higher education coming up next year. We have whoever is commander-in-chief is going to be dealing with comprehensive immigration reform. So there's all these different things that are going to be happening that we actually need to be activating people, agitating them, and organizing post-election. And I think that's another message that we need to really push out there is that our deadline isn't November 8th. We need to actually be pushing beyond then and identifying different leaders, politicizing folks, and figuring out what we're going to do post-November 8 as well. So I definitely agree with you on that.
Can I pick up? Oh, go ahead.
no,
You first, and then I'll go.
2 seconds. I will say it is incredibly important to recognize that for the past 20 years, there has been a conservative movement in this country to delegitimize government, to delegitimize our institutions, that has extended both to our media, so how we receive content and information. Why is that important? I was on Capitol Hill in 2008, 2009, after the election of Barack Obama. And I can't tell you how many of the Tea Party rallies where I walked to work and was called a nigger, was spit on, and was told I was trying to destroy a country when I was in the process of trying to get health care that they would be eligible for and not have to pay a penny. So I think it's important to recognize that part of the cynicism is connected to this greater movement to get us to not respect and see the value in the institutions around us. And in order for us to kind of reclaim that space, we also have to tell our stories and tell people how things are working and how we would seek and continue to seek to change things.
I just want to pick up on Brianna's point about the need for organizing. And I think Ferguson is a really good example of this. Because Ferguson, for about 100 years, even though it was a majority black city, just had white city council, like completely white city council for 100 years. And so after the shooting of Michael Brown, because of organizing, because of advocacy groups, including young people's groups, going door to door, and sometimes it takes that kind of connection, that sort of like door to door, like face to face discussion. They were able to double the turnout in the next city council. Now look, it just went from 15% to 30%, but you got to start somewhere, you know what I mean? They were able to double that turnout, and as a result, the city council is starting to change. So they were able to elect the first 3 African-American council members, which is a step. So I really appreciate that point of organizing and the need to really connect these issues to your day-to-day lives.
Mm-hmm.
Over here, question in the front.
Hi, everyone. So I've read your book, and I love it. And there's a part in your book where you talk about a Republican Royal Massett and how he supported the Texas voter ID law until he found that his 91-year-old mother that he was taking care of couldn't get his ID. And going off that, I love how you mentioned the primaries and how important the primaries are, because I don't think it's that far of a stretch to say if we dissuade someone to vote in the primary, they're not going to vote in the general. Going off of that, I want to talk about the caucus system. And I want to know what you guys think about whether or not the caucus system is inherently discriminatory against people that have like mental health issues or are disabled. Because if you go on like Iowa's disability rights webpage, there's a checklist that says you are eligible for this to come and like work. And also talking about like mothers or fathers who have children and they cannot go in caucus. What do you guys think about this whole system of the caucuses and whether or not you think they actually are, like they do dissuade the voter and they are, when we talk about accessibility, I think we need to address ableism and whether or not like, because like in my opinion, you may disagree, but caucuses are designed for the privileged and the able. And we dissuade a lot of voters who don't have that privilege to like get out of a wheelchair or stand on 2 feet or go to this place and stand it for hours on end because they have 3 children to take care of. So I would love for all of you guys to speak a little bit more on this caucus system and like, do you think that we should be holding the DNC and the RNC accountable to maybe move to a more move to a primary system so the ballot is more accessible for everybody, not just the privileged and the able?
Does one person want to take this so then we can get on?
Sure, I can just quickly address that. Completely agree. Caucuses are very much inside baseball, you know? And, you know, to your point, they definitely favor the privileged and, you know, those who are not disabled. I mean, think about it. It's like, just to be an individual who's voting in the primaries, you're, you know, of that 30% that happens to already be in the system. You take that down to the caucus level, and that is all the more esoteric. You have to have, I think you made the point, like 3 to 4 hours to get there. Who has that kind of time when you're picking up your kid after school or you're working 2 shifts? Or, you know, you're in class, or maybe you're just not that into all the candidates, you know, that you don't want to like spend 4 of your hours doing that. At the same time too, you know, let's say you do get there because it is a very inside baseball kind of move. You know, you're also more often than not giving away the secret ballot because you're kind of clustering around publicly. So completely agree. I mean, it's a very outdated system and it needs to be updated.
There's a question, 2 questions over there. We'll go to the woman on the right first.
I'll find my way there.
Okay, never mind. We'll get both questions in, don't worry.
Can you guys hear me? Okay. I just wanted to get a little bit more clarity about the state of the voting ID laws. I understand that, you know, Shelby opened the door to a lot of these laws, but with all of this litigation and the recent rulings, what do you expect the impact to be on voting in states like North Carolina or Texas or Wisconsin or some of the other places where there is ongoing litigation? Is there a new opening for students to use their voter IDs because of the laws, or is there still a lot of uncertainty about the final impact?
Yeah.
Right.
Yael, do you want to talk about that?
Sure.
Like in Texas and Wisconsin, they can vote with more IDs than before.
Right. Well, in Texas and North Carolina, they can now. And in Wisconsin, they created a kind of controversial middle ground for the upcoming election. But those are only in terms of what's happening in November. And we'll continue to move forward in terms of the litigation to knock it down. But I think that basically in North Carolina, the Fourth Circuit said it had a discriminatory intent, knocked down the photo ID requirement along with the other provisions in Texas as well. And so there have been kind of temporary solutions that have been put into place for the upcoming election, but not a permanent fix yet.
Yeah, I'll just clarify that a little bit more. In North Carolina, there's no photo ID required at all. In Texas, there's not photo ID required, but you have to have some sort of ID. So like in Texas, you're going to have to bring a bank statement or some sort of thing, but it doesn't have to be strict photo ID. And there's a lot of confusion over this.
Right.
I was just in Texas, and in the San Antonio Elections Office, they had a huge poster that said photo ID is required.
Right.
And I said, well, it's not required. Why is this still up? They said, well, we have the correct information behind the desk. And I'm like, okay, well, who's going to ask for that information? And I said, well, are you going to print new posters? They said, yeah. And I'm like, when? They're like, well, we're busy. I'm like, why don't you just take the incorrect poster down in the meantime. So this is the kind of stuff that we're
And it's a
dealing
question
with.
of what's considered to be a reasonable impediment too,
Yeah.
which is also discretionary based on who the election official is. So,
Just to carry on with that point a little bit, the way that the district court issued the order, basically, and when both the state and the plaintiffs came together and agreed to this settlement before the upcoming election, essentially what they said, it's like, okay, if you don't have the photo ID, if you have, as Yael mentioned, a reasonable impediment to getting this ID, then you can vote so long as you're showing your utility bill. Now, it is not for the election official, though, to challenge the voters' claim as to whether he or she has the reasonable impediment. And I think this is where some of the problems were cropping up, is that some county officials, even though the law was clear, were saying, well, we're going to conduct criminal investigations of those people who are claiming to have reasonable impediments. That's in no shape or form permitted under the law. And so I think it's a really good question that you ask about what's going to be in play in either North Carolina or Texas, because it's really going to require vigilance from here on out for people on the ground, whether you're an advocate, a voter, working for an elections official, to actually get really clear on what the state of the law is and spread that out there. Because otherwise, as we've heard before, there can be many poll workers who are just not adequately trained on what the law is, especially if you're getting some county officials who are kind of fudging with it.
And we are all members of a nonpartisan coalition on election protection that will have a nationwide hotline running on that day. We have fact sheets and information on where you are in each state and kind of what is the state of play. So we'll make sure that we connect so that you have that information. And if there are questions that are even popping up, particularly since in a few states we're getting ready to go into early voting beginning next week. So we are going to start to see patterns emerge and trends, and we'll be paying attention to
Exactly, and I want to just piggyback off what Michelle said. It's really important.
Excuse me.
The election is in most states is not on November 8th.
That's right.
The election is beginning in places like Wisconsin next week.
That's right.
Vote early. The likelihood is that you're going to have shorter lines if you vote early, and not only that, if you have problems, you can go back.
That's right.
And make sure that this is dealt with properly, as opposed to trying to do it all on election day, which is very chaotic. And also, just remember, you have a right to be here. If poll workers are challenging you, if election administrators are challenging you, you have a right to be there. Stay. If you try to ask for a supervisor, if not, call election protection.
That's right.
Make sure you don't leave without voting.
and the number is 866 our vote.
Or you get Donald Trump tweeting us in 140 characters, name calling, or Hillary Clinton responding to that as well. So I want to know, how much should us millennials be paying attention to social media, and how much should we be paying attention to, let's say, more reputable news sources and all that?
Anybody?
I would just say that any reputable organization has changed how they communicate to communities, and particularly millennials, to make sure that our information is accessible, and you can find us on Facebook, on social media. And the reason we do that is, as Chris mentioned, there's an overconsumption, particularly for African Americans. We spend a greater share of our time on smartphones and on social media than any other demographic. And so if we are trying to give you information and connect with you, we're going to be online. So I will tell you, we put our papers and our fact sheets and our columns, we try to distill it down to 140 characters and make it interesting, so you click, and we try to set up as much clickbait as possible. So I do think that you can pay attention to candidates who are putting out their information and putting forth their content, because where you are is where we need to be, and we need to cater towards you.
Okay, I think that's a sign that we're out of time. But thank you, everybody, for coming. I think the panelists will stick around for a few minutes if you want to talk to any of us. But thank you, and this discussion continues. At Common Cause?
Yes.
At Common Cause. Okay. Follow them on Twitter.